Good afternoon, class. This is the video for lecture 324-2020. I'm going to teach you about the transition to the online course, what are the next steps, and we'll start to talk about conflict. The first part of this is that you should see on the screen right now my WebCampus page. I'm showing the WebCampus page for a couple of reasons. The first is that I have on the syllabus, when you click on syllabus now, these are the readings. It's been updated, right? These are the readings that are expected of you for the remainder of the course. You should look at them and make sure that you have access to each of them as we're moving forward. On Thursday, we're going to read Goldstein and Peephouse. So in a few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about how you open that PDF to make sure we're all on the same page. The next part is the chat window. If you click on chat in WebCampus, you will see that there is a chat window from 2:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. on Tuesday and Thursday. I will be in this chat window. I can answer any questions, I can help you, I can look over grading. If it is a personal issue or if you don't feel comfortable, you can still use email, but I will be in this chat window during that time period. So if you have any issues, make sure to contact me this way, right? You can have a real-time response, or if you have something that you'd like to handle in private, you can always email me. Just make sure to use the kevin.worthy@unlv.edu address, and please do not use WebCampus to message me because I can't have WebCampus open to your message and WebCampus open to the grading, so I can't really see everything at the same time. Just use the email. So we'll go back to the syllabus really quickly, and we'll see that for Thursday we're supposed to be reading a Goldstein and Peephouse chapter 5. It is a text I used before. It's pretty good. What we want to look at is we're going to go in and just Google search Peephouse IR PDF. You're going to click on this link, and it is going to bring up this PDF. So let me go back to the first page. It should look like this image on the top, right? You've got Psi in the bottom right corner, sort of older references and some other aspects of it. This text is a PDF version. It is downloadable. It is free, right? You should just have access to it, and you should be able to just click on this link right here for that process. Make sure when you go into it that you can actually access it and read it. If you're having problems with accessibility, please contact me before next Thursday, and we are going to be reading chapter 5. So if you look here, we're going to be talking about international conflict and the types of war. The next part is that you do have a paper submission, some other things, and maybe a lot of you don't have on your computer Word, or you don't have whatever documents or Microsoft Office process. So the university actually provides free Microsoft Office, Word, PowerPoint, all of that. Normally I would just direct you to this site, right? This is the website that has it, but if we scroll down a little, what we'll notice is it has a Use at Home button, and you would click on this button. When you click on this button, it's going to bring up this document, and eventually what it's going to tell you to do is just to click on office.com. So let's click on it, and we'll see how this works out for us. Right, it logs me in automatically because I already have this set up. But what you want to look at is you want to make sure that you go through this process. You use your UNLV email. You have to set up a separate password. It's a little long of a process, but if you don't have access to Word, Excel, PowerPoint, things like that, you can use this, and you're going to need it for the paper when we get to the final part of this process. So those are the first few things that we have to talk about, right? We want to make sure that we're on the same page. From now until the end of the semester, we are expecting to be an online-only course. That's why you're seeing this sort of lecture this way. I'm doing a screenshot rather than seeing my face. I don't think it helps you to see my face, so the screenshot's the way that we're going to work. So now let's go into the actual material. So the PowerPoint will be uploaded. It's not uploaded now, but by the time that I upload the video, I'll upload the PowerPoint, and you should have access to it. So if you want to have it up, but I'm going to speak with the lecture up as we move forward. All right, here we go. Of course it's not. Okay. So we're talking about international relations. We are going to transition into international security. So we spent the first part of the course talking about the paradigms, the major paradigms of theories, realism, liberalism, constructivism. And we talked about critical theories, specifically post-structuralism and feminism. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take this grounding, this ontology and this theory grounding, right? We have ontology, and ontology means the nature of the world, right? That is the objective reality, the intersubjective, and the subjective. So each of those is an ontology of how we build the world, and we have to have an ontology first as we build the world. Then we have the critical theory, but now that we have this foundation, right? Think of it as a house. We have this foundation. We can now use that foundation to talk about real world topics. So when we're talking about international security, we're going to be a lot more concrete, We're going to have a lot more details. We're going to make sure that we're making a point about how this process works. Okay. So this is the international security aspect. There are a couple of different things. We're going to talk about foreign policy. Foreign policy is just the policies that states have for the international community and other states. Foreign policy is the setup of how you defend, right? How you set up your defenses and how you deal with other states. We're going to talk about homeland defense, right? Homeland defense is the actual physical security of your state. How do you defend it? The process you go through. When we talk about homeland defense, one of the parts that we're going to discuss is the difference between isolationism and intervention. Isolationism is where you just say, okay, the world can worry about itself. I'm not going to intervene, and it's not going to intervene in me. Intervention is where you go and you seek out, right? This is the same thing we've talked about earlier about preemptive strikes. I'm going to seek out threats, and I'm going to remove them before they come to threats, right? Before they can even become a real threat, I'm going to take care of them. When you're talking about those two different things, what we're really talking about is, are we talking about national defense? Are we talking about survival? Are we making sure that the state can survive? Or are we talking about defending state interests? One of the things about state interests is they're not always about survival in the short run, but they're considered to be about survival in the long run. Right? Russia wanted access to waterways and oil and resources. That's why it takes the Crimea. The United States wants access to oil, so it defends Kuwait, or it steps into Saudi Arabia when it needs to take up issues with Iraq, right? The state interest can be very, very broadly defined. So we want to make sure that we have that difference when we're talking about these things. And the other part is terrorism. Terrorism is not well defined. Who is a terrorist is not well defined. So in all of these factors, we want to make sure that we have a clear understanding. So when we have these complex concepts like terrorism, we can still have a good grounding of what we're talking about. Here we have three different types of actors. You have the state actor, right? The state actor is very clear. That's the United States, that's Belgium, that's Iraq, that's Russia, right? That is the state as an actor, right? This is very realist perception. The state is an actor, the state goes through a process, and it makes decisions on the international scale. We also have non-state actors. So non-state actors are any actor who has influence in the international system, but is not a state, right? It can be anything. It's a very, very broad category. When I say non-state actors, I could mean ISIS because they're never recognized as a state. I could mean a terrorist. I could mean an activist, right? Or I could mean Joaquin Phoenix, right? Joaquin Phoenix gives a speech. All of a sudden, some of us believe something differently. He is a non-state actor causing a change in policy in the international system. So not all non-state actors are terrorists. A lot of times when we're talking about this, you'll see non-state actor is defined as this bad thing. Non-state actors can be a lot of different things. The other part is an international organization. So we're going to split international organizations into two groupings. There's the intergovernmental organization. An intergovernmental organization is an organization that has states as members. So the United States is a member of the UN, right? Israel, Egypt, right? Venezuela, Brazil, they're members of the UN. So when you have an intergovernmental organization, it's an organization which has states as members. That's what really matters. Why does it matter that it has states as members? Because they're going to behave differently. If you have a membership of states, those states are going to want to have their own independent will, their own agency, as we discussed, right? Agency matters. When you have a non-governmental organization, these are, right, we would call them NGOs. You should be very familiar with NGOs, right? It's like the Red Cross. These are organized for a goal, right? The individual actors in a non-government organization don't have as much agency because they're already aligned under one goal, right? What do they all want? A non-government organization is a grouping where of people or actors or states, any mixture of those things in which the individuals and the actors together all want the same goal, right? They want the same goal. The Red Cross wants to decrease suffering, right? It's for the March of Dimes, they want to cure a disease. So all of these factors come into play. So let's go back a little and let's talk about why a state would go to war. The first part is a state would go to war because it has some sort of status quo issue, right? Status quo is the way the world exists right now. The world exists this certain way. You have a status quo. You want to make sure that your status quo is just the world as it is, right? We're not adding some sort of will or sort of impetus or anything like that. The status quo is just the way the world exists in this very moment, right? In the moment that you're picking. So Russia, we're talking before it takes over the Crimea, it's in a position where it doesn't really have great access to the West. Maybe it wants more access to sort of natural gas lines or waterways or whatever it is. And so Russia and Ukraine are two different states, and the Crimea is part of Ukraine. Russia then decides that they want to change the status quo, right? When we talk about Firon, which we'll talk about a little more, there's this idea of it being an aggressor state. And Russia is a perfect example of an aggressor state. I don't like the status quo. I'm going to use my strength and my military, my power, to try and take something from another state. So this is this will to change, right, the status quo. I want to change the status quo. I'm going to be aggressive in that process. When Russia makes that, the Ukraine has to decide whether or not to fight or accept the Russian demands. Remember that Firon makes his point very clear. If you knew the outcome of the war, then you would just accept the outcome and skip the war, right? Ukraine, as we saw, chose not to fight Russia and allow them to bring their troops in rather than fight because they knew they would lose. So it makes more sense just to allow that process to occur than to fight, lose, and then also lose the territory. So Ukraine follows this process. Piran talks about this when we go to the next slide, right? This is the rational decision process. And when we talk about a rational decision process, remember that we don't always have perfect information. You can still be rational without all of the information. So when we talk about rational process, right, a rational decision process, we're talking about rational choice, we're talking about what information is available, right? I don't have all of the information, but I want to get as much information as I possibly can. So Firon makes this argument that Russia would want to misrepresent how willing they are to go to war. Right? During this time period, Russia is saying the Crimea is part of Russia and we're going to come in and take it. And they have to convince the Ukraine that they will go to war for the Crimea, right? They have to convince them, even if it's not true, they have to convince the Ukrainians that they're willing to go to war. Then they have to convince the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian state, that they will win the war, which is much easier, right? We know the Russian military, access to the size of militaries is pretty obvious in the modern era. So we know that the Russian military far outstrips, right, is much more powerful than the Ukrainian military. The next part that we're going to talk about is this commitment problem issue. Can I trust Russia to only take the Crimea, right? What if it's the same thing that we saw in World War II with Hitler and Germany, that they say, okay, we just want to annex this small piece of land and then we'll stop. Now, Russia has not expanded, but we did see previously in World War II that they had used that to annex a small territory and continue to push outward. So these commitment problems are there, right? Can I trust you to hold up your agreements? And if you're a state actor, if you're the United States, if you're Russia, if you're Ukraine, whatever it is, you're always going to act in your own interest. So even if you have a commitment to another state, you're not going to uphold that commitment if it's going to cost your state. Right? So commitment problems are very real. We see them a lot. That's why alliances shift so rapidly. And then the last part is that is there something else I can offer? Right? Is there something else I can offer instead of what you're asking? And this comes up this idea of issue indivisibility and side payments. There is this concern that the issue is indivisible, right? That the whole Crimea has to be given. But the Ukraine state could work with the Russians and say, okay, we don't want to give you all of this territory, but what if we give you some of this territory and access to waterways, right? These agreements can occur. So this process of why we go to war, right, this rational decision process includes what can I trade instead of a conflict as well. A conflict might be unavoidable, but you always want to look for things that you can exchange instead of that conflict if you know, right? If you're Ukraine and you know you're going to lose that conflict. We talked about limits on rational choice, right? When you have individuals, there's always the concern that they're operating under bounded rationality. And the big problem about bounded rationality is this idea of satisficing, right? You only get to a specific threshold, and then you say this is a good enough decision. Humans do this all the time. States don't do this. Ukraine did not use bounded rationality. States value and weigh every option. They make sure they look at every option and see what are the possible options, and they pick the best option that they have. It may not be a good option, but it's the best available. So we're not worried about bounded rationality when it comes to states. When it comes to individuals, we will talk about bounded rationality more. The next part is emotions and pride. So individuals and state leaders, right? Remember that state leaders are human, right? They can be part of this, and their emotions and their pride can get in the way of their decisions. But we have to talk about this difference between, is something irrational, or are they talking about non-material benefits? Remember that in rational choice, the reward is not just money. It's not just power, right? That you can have as part of your reward other things. Your emotions can tie into what you feel is a reward, right? What do you value and what do you give value to? And not just material things. It's not just money and tanks and weapons that have value in rational choice. Everything has value in rational choice. So you might say it's more important to me to stand and fight because my reward for fighting is intrinsic, right? That I have a need to fulfill this. I can't just give you something without fighting. And so that can be part of the rational choice, but it's very difficult to separate the two, right? Are we talking about rational choice and pride as part of their calculation, or are their emotions blocking their rational choice and they're making bad decisions? Now, when we're talking about making bad decisions and not following rational choice, when you have sort of emotions and pride influences, one of the biggest things we're concerned about is groupthink. Groupthink is this process where individuals start to follow a leader despite evidence to the contrary, right? This is where we worry about rational choice sort of falling apart. This is the idea that you would agree with your boss even if you knew he was wrong because he was your boss. And then over time, you would start to accept the thought process of your boss. And we saw this from President Bush in 2002 to 2003. He really wanted, we know this now, that he wanted there to be weapons of mass destruction. He wanted the investigators to find these weapons and make these arguments. And so because we knew the president's preferences, the people that worked for the president started modifying their speech and behavior to fit with the president's. They started exaggerating evidence, or they started to make it seem like evidence was there even if they didn't truly believe it, and then over time they all come to the same process. When you're all thinking as a group, those two, that's one of the things that can happen, is that you start to agree with your boss despite evidence to the contrary. The other part is that you start eliminating options. If all of you think war is a good thing, right, if you all think there's glory and pride in war, right, then there's no outside voice arguing against that. And because we know that leaders surround themselves with people that agree with them, right, you always run into this risk of groupthink, where one person's biases become the entire group's biases, and they're incapable of seeing sort of an outside alternative, or they might be ignoring evidence altogether. So let's go into conflict. And what do I specifically mean by conflict? Now, the first part is that in international relations, in this course, right, in this subfield of political science, I shouldn't say subfield, field of political science, conflict involves physical harm. When I say there is a conflict, I mean someone died. And I usually refer to this idea of battle deaths. And battle deaths is defined, right, whether we're talking about correlates of war, or we're talking about UCPD PRIO data sets. When we look at conflicts, we count battle deaths. And battle deaths have a couple of things that matter. The first is that you have to have two organized groups. This can be a terror cell, this can be another state, this can be two ethnic groups, but they have to be two organized groups that are competing, right? It can't be the state killing one person. We have a word for that, it's called democide, right? The state can kill people, right? We'll talk about this later, but there are a lot of things that don't fit into this. You have to have two organized groups. They have to be armed. They have to have the intent of either controlling territory or changing who controls that government. Right? There has to be two organized groups. And then we create a conflict threshold. For a lot of the research that we see, the conflict threshold is 25 battle deaths in a given year. If you have 25 battle deaths or more in a given year, then that's considered a conflict year. For that country, that state, was at war, right? Excuse me, not war. We'll talk about war as a legal process next class. There's a conflict if there are over 25 deaths in a given year, right? That's what we want to focus on. So what do I not mean by conflict? And this might help clarify what I don't mean. The first part is whenever you have a political party competing for elections, that's not conflict, right? We should always see opposition. We should always see political parties. In fact, the more that they are using the political process to gain power, the less they are using violence to get power. So political parties, right, competition, elections, all of that is not conflict. It is antithetical to conflict. It is different because the more that they trust the elections will decide who's in power, the less they will turn to violence and conflict, meaning violence. The next part is structural violence. So structural violence is this idea that there are these rules or these practices in place, and there just aren't opportunities for a certain group, right? Women can't get in certain jobs, right? Before the 20th century, if your husband died and you were a female and you had children, you would be destitute because no one would hire you to do most jobs. You just couldn't find enough to support your family. So structural violence is this, I can't get opportunities. We're not going to talk about structural violence. We're going to talk about physical violence. So while structural violence is a factor that we should be concerned about, right now we're going to focus on physical violence and physical violence when it comes to organized groups. Another thing about conflict is disagreements about policy. We do include protests sometimes in IR, but for this course and for right now, when I'm talking about conflict, I don't mean protests. I don't mean people going out into the streets. That's all part of a normal political process. When I say conflict, I mean that breakdown. I mean the breakdown where you have violence towards each other. And that's the last point that I want to make is battle deaths and conflict are not murder, right? Murder is a legal status. If someone is killed through a battle death, right, if they are killed in combat, that's not necessarily murder. The other thing about murder is the motives for murder are typically person to person. One person murders another for a personal reason. That is not the case for conflict. In conflict, groups form, right? If we're talking about specifically ethnic conflict, a group will form and that group will attack another group. But those individuals don't know each other, right? It's not a personal grudge. It's about the organized armed conflict of those two groups, right? So murder is separate from this, and it's very difficult to distinguish between who was murdered and who died as part of that conflict, right? There's a very difficult process to deal with. Now we're talking about level of conflict. So there are three separate levels of conflict, and they are out of order in this slide, and I apologize for that. Interstate conflict is conflict the way we would think of war, right? It's Georgia, excuse me, let's not use the example of Georgia because that's confusing. It's the idea of Iran and Iraq going to war, right? Iran and Iraq goes to war. The United States and Iraq go to war. The United States and Russia are part of a Cold War, which we'll talk about later, that's state to state, right? One state in conflict with another. The next level of conflict is subnational conflict. So subnational conflict is a conflict in which a state has a rebel group, a terrorist group, or some other non-state actor that is either killing their population or trying to take control. Right? If we talk about rebel groups, often they want to control territory. They want to take over territory. If it's a terrorist group, they want to influence policy. But this is subnational, right? This is below the state, right? So if you have a specific region in the country that's having an issue, right, but it has to be violent and there have to be two organized groups. The next thing is internationalized conflict. Internationalized conflict is where you have a group in sort of a non-state actor in a territory that is causing some sort of issue, but it gets elevated to international because of the cross-national aspects or the transnational aspects. Afghanistan becomes an internationalized conflict because even though the actors are not part of the state, and even though the actors in Afghanistan are not directly attacking other states, it is those local actors that are causing sort of this ability to fund terrorism or to organize or train terrorists. And so when the US invades Afghanistan, they're not actually, they are removing the regime, but they're not declaring war on Afghanistan. They do not declare war. right? A declaration of war is a different thing in the United States. But this becomes an internationalized conflict. The issue becomes internationalized. The same thing with Yemen, with Qatar, right? All of these states have an issue of these minor non-state actors, but because those minor non-state actors are crossing state lines, then the conflict becomes internationalized, right? The US is going out and seeking these people regardless of what state they're in. And when your enemy is across multiple state lines in the way that some of these terror groups are organized, we would consider that an internationalized conflict. On Thursday, we're going to talk about this, but I want to give you a brief overview today. The first part is types of conflict. There are two different types of conflict. There's a conflict of ideas and there's a conflict of interests. And it's not always one or the other, right? You can have a conflict of ideas that also has a conflict of interest, right? You might say that that ethnic group is different from you, but the reason why you say it's different from you is because you want to control a part of their territory. You want the access to the sea that the other group has. They are still separate reasons for conflict, and a lot of times those conflicts don't overlap, but that doesn't mean they can't overlap. So a conflict ideas could be ethnicity or religion or ideology. A conflict ideas is where you have a different idea about something and it causes you to have an outgroup, right? An in-group and out-group, and the two of you are struggling to come together, and this causes a conflict where you have violence and battle deaths. Ethnic conflict is the most common because you have a lot of ethnicities that were forced or just exist in the same state. So when you look at Rwanda, you look at Ethiopia, you look at a lot of these states, you have multiple ethnicities that exist. And because they exist and they have their own power centers, their own structures, their own ideas, right, they're going to have a conflict of what's the right way to be. Historically, we saw this also with sort of Catholics and Protestants, right? Catholics and Protestants go to war, right? They fight over what's the right religious process, what's the right thing to believe, right? These are conflicts of ideas. When we're talking about conflict of interests, these are a little more straightforward. I want this bridge. I want to have control over this bridge. Or when we're talking about control over government, right? If you don't have a democratic society and you want to be in control of government, you have to fight for that control over the government, right? We think about right now, even though there have been elections in Syria, the rebel groups didn't want to be led by Assad, and they didn't want to face this process, so the rebel groups formed their own sort of control, and they start fighting for control over the government. And the last is economic interests. Some rebel groups and some terror groups are really more concerned about what funding they can get in their conflict, right? If you are part of a rebel group, you need funding, and part of that funding might be either through sales of opium, or it might be by controlling certain fields, right? You want to maintain your economic interests, and because those interests are different between the two actors, right, you have a conflict of who gets to control those economic interests, who gets to sort of benefit from those resources. So those are two different types of conflict, ideas and interests, and we'll talk about them more Thursday after you have read PFAS Chapter 5. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the paper. The paper is going to be due in a couple of weeks, so I want to get you a very clear sort of idea of what I am expecting. First, you got to use Times New Roman, 12-point font, double spaced, right? All of the normal stuff that you would expect. And I showed you already how to get access to Microsoft Office. If you're still having problems, please contact me. I will be in the chat from 2:30 to 5 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I can help you through the process in real time. You want to have it formatted in a certain way. You want at least one sentence on the 5th page, right? One sentence on the 5th page. I don't want any header or footer. I don't want to have anything in the top of the paper except a title, and the title should be one sentence max. A lot of students in the past have said, well, I'm going to put my name and your name is professor and the course number, and I'm going to put these 4 lines, I'm going to put them on every single page. Well, all you're doing is taking up space. And I know you're taking up space, and you know you're taking up space, right? So when you look at your paper, if you have 4 pages of text, and you're going to need 4 pages, right? And when I say one sentence on the 5th page, right, you're typing, it goes into the 5th page, right? That's enough, right? You want to make sure that you're there because it's the only way they're going to cover enough material. So that's the format of the paper, right? Just formatting. Here's the guidelines. You want to have at least 6 sources. You want 6 sources. You want them peer-reviewed from the library website. So go to the library website, make sure that you are looking at peer-reviewed sources, make sure they're journal articles, make sure that they actually talk about the topic that you want to talk about, and then cite them. And we'll talk about citation in a second. You can and want to include as much from the course as possible, right? You want to look at the things that we read during the course and you want to include them in your paper. That's going to make it easier. The stuff that I picked is either textbooks, right, that we have used in the past, or journal articles. So you can consider that part of your 6 sources. You want to make an argument, right? I don't want to just hear about what you read. I want you to explain, right, why those works, why those statements support your argument, right? This is still empirical. I know that we've talked about this, right? I don't want anything normative. I don't want first person. I don't want opinion. But when you're talking about these articles, there's evidence to support what they're saying. The difference between an empirical argument and an opinion is an empirical argument has evidence to support the statements it's using, right? There are 180 calories in this soda. That's not an opinion, that's an empirical statement because we can look at the calorie content, right? We know certain things and we want to make those arguments as clearly as possible. You can pick a side, and you're going to be a little biased in this, and I know you're going to be biased in it, and that's completely okay. Pick a side for an argument. Not this is wrong, but this is happening, and this is why it's happening, and this is what we see as it's happening, right? Make an argument. You want to make the argument broad enough to cover the material you have, but narrow enough that you don't end up being too sort of thin on your details, right? I need to see evidence that you've read material, that you've understood material. So what evidence supports your argument? So point to things that I can say, yes, that's evidence, right? Whether it be statistical regression, or it be a case study, or just something in the works that you use that is evidence to support your argument. Then I want you to completely flip it. I want you to take the other side, right? Sometimes we call this Lincoln-Douglas debate style, where you find a weakness in your own argument. You say, this is a problem with my argument, and you figure out why it's a weakness, right? And then don't just pick something easy, right? Don't pick something minimal. Pick something that can actually be weakness. And I say no paper tigers, no straw man. What that means is don't find like, oh, they're talking about something from the 90s and this other guy saying we should be thinking about the 2000s. That's a minor point. Find a real weakness and then see if it damages your argument. And if it does damage your argument, be honest about that. Just say, look, I made this argument and then I started to look at this weakness, and this is a major weakness in this argument. That's perfectly acceptable to recognize. Recognizing a weakness in your own argument is perfectly acceptable. That should be the body of your paper, right? Make an argument and then find a weakness in your argument. That should be the body of your paper, and it should be about 4 pages. About 4 pages. So it's about the full length of the paper that we're expecting. I want you to write the body first. Write the body first, and then add the intro and conclusion later, right? Because what I want from an intro and conclusion, what should be your intro and conclusion, is that it should summarize the body. You should say in your intro, this is what we're going to talk about, and then you have the body, and in the conclusion you say, this is what we talked about. Intro and conclusion are just ways to say, to sort of encapsulate the body. So make your body first, make the arguments first, and then sort of format it afterwards, right? Remember, the introduction and the conclusion, those are just ways to make it a paper, to formalize it, to make it seem nicer, but the body is what matters. The arguments are what matter. You find your articles on the library page, so that's library.unlv.edu. Make sure you use the Chicago citation. So real quick, I'm going to show you this process, and hopefully it's not a complete disaster when I do this. So just go to the library webpage. My computer is very slow, so I apologize if this is going to take forever with the recordings. And then you can just type in whatever you're looking for, and it's going to bring up some results eventually. And then there is a button on the page. I'm really maxing on my computer, so I apologize if this it seems slow. And you click the citation button, and it's going to give you some options. Make sure you click on the Chicago to Arabian style, and do you see now you can just copy this. So when you're doing this, right, eventually as juniors and seniors, you're going to want to learn citation style. But for now, I just want you to know how you get a citation from the library website, how you find an article that matters. All right, let's go back to this. So that's the Chicago citation, right? We've gone over, right, the updates, right, how to access this, right? So let's talk about what is due next class. In the next class, you have assignment 6 is due. I'm trying to get you guys to put in work so that at the end of the semester, I don't have a lot of panicked emails. So it's going to be due at 2 o'clock on Thursday. It's due before class because at 2 o'clock, I'm going to upload this lecture. I want you to do the work, and then I want you to come into class, this sort of virtual class session, and watch the lecture for Thursday. I want you to talk about what you've read so I know that you're going off the reading and not off my video. You should be reading Peeve House Chapter 5, so the assignment will be about Peeve House Chapter 5. And then the last part is you can email me at any point with questions, or you can contact me via the chat. I'm going to be answering questions today, right? Today is Tuesday, so between now and 2:30, I'll be answering questions as much as I can in email. But if you want to talk to me in real time, 2:30 to 5, Tuesdays and Thursdays on the WebCampus chat. So that's the last part that I'm going to show you, is that when you go into here, you can scroll down and there is a chat button, and it should pop up and you should see that you can chat to me, and during class time in my office hours, I will be live. Thank you for listening to this. I know it's a lot. Hopefully this video uploads and you can watch it. Try and keep up and make sure you message me about any questions and concerns early so we can do this as clearly as possible. Okay, thank you.